Welcome to Season 3 of Robbie Burns and Friends. Robbie Burns and Friends is a conversational interview show about music, technology, productivity, and the creative process. This week's guest is Daniel Spreadbury, product manager of music notation editor Dorico. Well, do you want to just jump right into it? I mean, there's a lot I'd love to ask you, but I guess
let's do it.
The core of it is I'd love to talk a little bit about Dorico.
Ask me anything. I am an open book, so just go for it.
Well, I think one of the things that well, let me ask you this: when you posed out to Twitter a couple of weeks ago, you said it had been a long time since you had been on a podcast. How many people reached out to you after that?
Well, I've recorded one already, and I'm recording one tonight with you, which is great, and I'm recording another one tomorrow night, so that's 3. And in fact, there was a fourth one as well, but that was like recording the very next day.
Oh, wow.
And I wasn't able to make it to the recording. That was one of those sort of panel podcasts where they record in a particular location with a bunch of people. So I couldn't do that one, but maybe next time that one records, I might be able to get on that one. So, I mean, I love podcasts. I listen to podcasts all the time. I actually listen to way more podcasts than I listen to music these days. And I think they're a really tremendous medium, and you can hear all sorts of interesting conversations. And I love all the more produced ones as well. The ones that the Radio Labs of this world and so on. I just think podcasts are great. So anytime I get the chance to be on one, I jump at it.
So do you have, the holidays are upon us. Do you, are you getting a break from the development of Dorico?
Well, I'm not going into the office, but I don't know if you're familiar with the cartoon Inspector Gadget.
Oh, sure, for sure.
Right, and he says Inspector Gadget is never off duty. I kind of feel the same way. Also, I have a dog and a niece who are way cleverer than me. They do all my work for me.
Really?
Yeah. No, it would be good.
Oh, I get it. I get it. It's an Inspector Gadget reference.
Yes.
Oh my goodness. That's awesome. Well, and you're never off the clock. I'll tell you what. Every time I post to the Dorico forum, I think 90% of the time you're the one who answers.
Yes, I have a disease, I think. A sort of compulsion, which I've had for a long time. I think it's because when I started at Sibelius all those years ago, it's nearly 20 years ago now, the job that I started doing was technical support. And I think it was actually the fact that I did engage with the customers so much that meant that when Ben and Jonathan were looking for somebody to kind of start stepping into some of the more kind of product management-y roles, though we didn't call it product management in those days, I think I seemed like the natural person because I was, crazily enthusiastic and also had spoken to thousands of customers at that point and really, really knew what they wanted and what they were asking for. And I think it's just invaluable, basically, to have that direct communication with customers. And I think the other thing is that I just can't bear the thought that, it might be midnight or whatever and I'm feeling tired, but I know that there are people all over the world who are using the products that we've built, and if I have the chance to help somebody and unblock somebody's work for the next, however many hours they might still be up and working before I go to bed, then it kind of almost seems irresponsible
right.
not to try and have a quick look and see if I can answer any questions.
It makes total sense. One of my favorite developers for the Mac is Omni Group. Makers of
products.
Omnifocus Task Manager and an outlining app called Omni Outliner, and their position on their team for customer support is actually called Support Human.
That's very good. We ought to call our support people support humans. Yeah, I think that's good.
I love it. Well, then that's a very human way to think about customer support: is someone is doing work, someone is running into a block, and that block could potentially be lifted.
Yep. Exactly.
So I didn't want to start with this part of, I did want to talk a little bit about your start at Sibelius. It wasn't really the most natural first question, but since you mentioned it, I did not know that did you start on the support team there?
I did, yeah. So I'd done my music degree and I'd graduated, and like many musicians, decided I'm never going to work in an office. I'm going to be a musician, damn it. And Julie got a job as a singer at a cathedral, Ely, outside of Cambridge. And of course, Sibelius was founded in Cambridge. That's where the offices were. Well, actually, Ben was in Cambridge and Jonathan was in London. And so the development was being done in London with Jonathan in a little office in Putney at that time. And Ben had a little office, a really weird triangular-shaped office on top of a bank near Footlights Restaurant in Cambridge, which was fun. And I'd been doing some singing and so on, and I was pretty much out of money. You know what it's like. You're singing a couple of hours a day, and church singing jobs do not pay great. And I'd been doing some temporary work, did a bit of work in a computer shop, did a bit of work as a secretary for a social studies lecturer at the university in Cambridge, not Cambridge University, but the other one, the one that's now known as Anglia Ruskin University. She was a really interesting lady, but she wanted me to take on the job permanently, and because of my commitments at the cathedral, it wasn't something I could do. I could only work till sort of 3:30 in the afternoon, and then I had to dash back to Ely to go and get ready for Evensong every day. Anyway, it was all going a bit wrong. I was enjoying the music, but very poor, basically, and living in this horrible flat that was very cold all the time. It's not a very warm part of the country. And the organist at the cathedral happened to get an email from Sibelius saying they were looking for people they were looking for a copywriter, and they were looking for a technical support person. And I actually applied for the copywriter job because English had always been my thing. If I hadn't done music, I would have done literature at university, that's for sure. And so I applied for the copywriter job and didn't get that, but I did get offered the technical support job. So I took that, and it was great. The amazing thing about Sibelius in those days, it was very small. I think it was sort of employee number 12 or something like that, and we later on grew to be about 80 people. So I was in, not really at the very beginning, but certainly the beginning of the Windows version and just before the Mac version came out. And it was a company of musicians, and so when I said, well, look, I'd really like to keep singing at the cathedral and leave work early every day, they were completely supportive of it. So it was really good, and it really was like being welcomed into a family, which was something that at the time I really needed. Obviously, I had the church community, but everybody in the church community kind of tends to have their own jobs already. If you're a lay clerk at a cathedral, normally you get a job at the cathedral school, or you get a job working for the chapter house, and maybe you even get accommodation and so on. But I was kind of unlucky. I came in late. They were recruiting for 2 lay clerks, and a friend of mine became the other one, and I became the tenor one, and he got the job at the school, and I got basically nothing, which is just the luck of the draw, really. But yeah, through Sibelius, then I sort of got a whole new family in this new part of the country that I was living in, and that family is, many parts of it still together now, working on Dorico sort of 18, 19 years later.
Sure, that's really awesome. So how did you? What was next for you in the Sibelius team? How did you move through that team? Yeah,
so once I'd actually joined the company, Ben Finn, one of the 2 twins who founded the company, he was still writing all the documentation at that stage. In fact, he'd had to write the Windows documentation basically from his hospital bed because he had appendicitis just before the Windows version came out, a couple of months before I joined the company. And so he was literally kind of on a laptop. And we're talking now 1998 style laptops,
right.
So not exactly the sort of slim and sleek MacBooks that we might use today. So having this, huge, great big lumpen thing on his lap, writing the documentation from his hospital bed. He sort of, once they realised that I was vaguely literate, that they thought it might make sense for me to take that on. So the next job that I had, and I was still doing technical support as well at the same time, was to take on the documentation, and that was great. I mean, I love writing, and also the sort of the satisfaction. Back in those days, we were printing manuals. We would actually have them printed spiral bound with nice card covers and everything. And every time we would do a new update to Sibelius, which we were doing all the time at that stage, I can't even count the number of updates we did between the time I joined and the last version 1 update. It must have been 8 or 9 updates, and so we would update the manual for each of those, and at various points along the way I was converting it from Microsoft Word into Quark Express, and then back to Microsoft Word again, and then eventually into Adobe FrameMaker, which was by far the best product for doing that kind of long-form, structured technical writing at the time. And, so I was learning a lot of new tools, and I was getting to document this product that I was in love with, and I was taking something off Ben's plate, which was good because he was supposed to be running the company and not writing the documentation. So that was really good, and I did that through the version 2 timescale, so that's like 2001 or so. And then as we started planning version 3, I started to actually spend some time, and all this while I was in Cambridge with Ben and the other tech support people and finance and order processing and all those sort of operational people. And Jonathan was still down in London by now in Waterloo, near Waterloo Station, with his slightly enlarged development team, and we had the Windows and Mac versions out, of course. And so I ended up starting to go down to London 2 or 3 days a week to work in Jonathan's office and get to know the developers a bit better. And then, it was a real sort of thrill/terrifying experience to be basically sat between Ben and Jonathan when we were starting to plan out what the features for version 3 would be. And they would argue about what they thought we should do and why, and we developed quite a sophisticated methodology for trying to rank the features that we were going to actually implement in each version. And they would, because they're brothers, twin brothers, know each other extremely well, don't always agree with each other. They would actually argue, and that was quite weird to be sat there in between these two brothers arguing. But we got through it, and I became more involved. And then by the time we were speccing out Sibelius 4, which is when we introduced dynamic parts and other bits and bobs like that, they had taken sort of more of a back seat in the product management side of things, and that was basically then that became my job. And it was while we were working on Sibelius 5 that they sold the company to DigiDesign, as it was in those days, who were part of Avid, but were still, at that point, Avid was still run as all of these separate companies. So it was actually DigiDesign that acquired us. Sort of looking back on it now, it's obvious that what they were doing was putting me in that position so that they could take a step back in order to focus on selling the company and moving on to do other things. But it was a tremendous experience for me because, as I say, we didn't call it product management in those days, this kind of discipline of understanding requirements and then converting them into technical requirements that the developers can do, and then working closely with the developers as the requirements evolve to figure out exactly how that's going to work for the end user. And then, of course, communicating that to the end user at the other side once we've actually done it. And it was, as I say, it was a real learning experience for me, and I entirely have Ben and Jonathan's sort of generosity with their time and expertise to thank for my career, basically. So they saw something in me they thought was useful, and they gave me the ball, and I ran with it. And all the time we were there at Sibelius, even after the Avid acquisition, I always felt that my role was to sort of, what would Ben and Jay have done, and try and kind of keep the program going in their image. It's a bit different now, of course. At Dorico, we sort of had that tabula rasa where we could figure it all out again from scratch for ourselves, and that's why I think we've taken some quite different decisions to the decisions that we took over the years on Sibelius as we started out with Dorico. But certainly that discipline, that experience of working with them, and sort of the methodologies that we developed for figuring out what to do and how, those things have all been invaluable to me in the years since.
Yeah, wow, that's really interesting. So what kind of interests me, and I don't know how candidly you can go here. I mean, clearly to me, the move away from the Sibelius team marks, to me, potentially some things that are very interesting about where Avid sees notation software fitting into their vision, but also where they are seeing the future of it as sort of, I'll be honest, I still don't fully understand why Sibelius is a part of their, I don't know if we could call Pro Tools, Media Composer, and Sibelius a suite of apps. They certainly work together in some ways, but I guess, at a certain point, you and part of your team moved on. And I guess is there anything that you can comment on about that in any way highlights sort of where they were going with Sibelius and where you and some of your team saw maybe a different path for the future?
Well, I mean, I think, if they hadn't decided to close our office, we would have sort of soldiered on as we had been, really. I think that it was tough at times. Avid was a big company, going through a certain amount of fairly well publicized restructuring, because, as I say, when they acquired Sibelius, it was run as these independent companies: Digidesign, Pinnacle, M Audio, Softimage, iNews, Avid itself with Media Composer and those things, all pretty much run independently. And over the course of the next few years, they obviously figured out that, hey, and of course this was in the middle of the credit crunch as well, so that sort of 2007, 2008 financial crisis period happened just after we were acquired, and obviously affected lots and lots of companies, not just Avid. And I think they were looking at, here's a business that's turning over hundreds of millions of dollars. I think at one point in those early years after the acquisition, we were looking at sort of a $1 billion a year turnover, but not making a profit. And so the company engaged some sort of management consultants to figure out how to take the company and make it more profitable. And, that was a long process, and it was a painful process because, of course, if you're going to integrate a bunch of separate businesses, you have to integrate functions together, consolidate them, which might mean losing teams in particular locations. And, it certainly became, for us in Sibelius, we feared October, because that was the point at which the HR people would turn up, and you would find out which group of people were going to be made redundant or laid off, as you'd say in the States. At that point, it was normally around that time of year, because the Avid's financial year runs January to December, and that was when they would look at, are we going to make our final year figures? Okay, we're not. Let's do that. And my wife was one of the people who lost their jobs in one of those rounds, and of course, lots of friends of ours, mutual friends of ours, lost their jobs at various points through there, and that was tough, But we always still believed in the product, and we did still have the support of the business in building the product, and it was very successful. There was no way in which what happened to us when they decided to close our office was as a result of the performance of the product in the marketplace. Far from it. It was doing better than ever. It did slightly irk me to see the person who kind of succeeded me immediately after my departure sort of going around saying, oh, well, the most recent version wasn't as successful as the previous one, and that was definitely untrue.
Which version was that?
So that was version 7, yeah. We released Sibelius 7 in, I think it was June of 2011, and then we were sort of given the heave-ho about a year later, in July of 2012. But as I say, the product was doing great. There was nothing wrong with its sales. It was continuing to be very successful. I think really what it came down to was a few different factors about which I guess I'm speculating, really. One of them is that we would have had to have moved office, and property prices in London were crazy, still are crazy, and maybe they didn't want to do that. Also, they did have this kind of strategy at the time. I've no idea if it's still the case now, where they wanted to move towards having a mixture of some development people kind of onshore, as it were, in facilities owned and paid for by Avid rather, and employed directly by Avid, and they wanted to have some that were working for outsourcing subcontractors and so on. And so at that point, Sibelius didn't have anybody working offshore, and so they wanted to do that, but they, this sort of confluence of events meant that they basically wanted to move everybody offshore and close the office completely. And that was a real shock to us, because, as I say, the product was doing fine. But of course, there were other things going on at the same time. The day before we found out that we were going, the company sold off M Audio and Pinnacle, so it kind of exited these consumer businesses. And I think again, I have no knowledge of what's going on at Avid, and I probably should be careful about what I say about what I knew at the time. But what we understood was that Sibelius was still important to them because it's integrated into Pro Tools and it's part of that kind of creative sort of suite of these applications, like you say, Media Composer, Pro Tools, Sibelius. They're not kind of an integrated suite in the way that, say, the Adobe apps are, but they're certainly, together in that media production workflow, as well as all the other things that Sibelius does. And yeah, I think it was just a combination of factors. I don't think it was because they were unhappy with the work that we were doing, but it was just this combination of factors to do with the company direction, renewing the lease, this sort of outsourcing decision. All those sort of things came together.
So Sibelius moves on. At a certain point, I don't know how long it was before this point, but at a certain point, you were thinking about what's next. Before that, or during that, or even now, do you feel like the direction of Sibelius has, has it moved in a direction that you can see yourself now? If you were still there, like, would you be really happy to be working on the product that it is now?
I mean, it's hard to say, really. I think that quite a lot of the things that they've done in terms of the features and things they've added are definitely things that we would have done. They're things that would have been on our list. In fact, things that were on our list for a long time. And I think, to their credit, I think they have continued in more or less the direction that we would have been going. I would guess probably at a slightly slower rate because of the sort of having to staff up new people to learn how the program works and all the rest of it. But I think that in general, the things that they've done are things that we would have done, among other things. I think Sibelius, of course, it's a great product. We worked for a long, long time to make it a great product, and it's still used by many tens of thousands of musicians around the world, and will be for years to come. And I think that's a testament to Ben and Jonathan's original design work. It's a testament to the work that the team, the original team that Ben and Jonathan hired, put into it over many years, and a testament to the work that the people who've been working on it for the last few years have put into it. And I'm glad Sibelius still exists, and I don't use it myself anymore at all for anything. But I know that lots of people still do, and until Dorico or another program offers a complete enough alternative and enough of a desirable reason to stop using it, I guess people will be using it for a long, long time to come.
So at a certain point, you oriented towards this new project. Can you talk a little bit about, where did that come from? Was it like you just had this hunger to continue to develop this kind of software, or did you feel like there was needed to be a new foundation laid for what you saw as the future of notation?
Well, I think what it came down to is that we as a team wanted to stay together more than anything else. Most of us had been working together since the early 2000s, and so most of us were pretty young when we started working together. Not long out of university, and we've kind of seen each other get married and grow up and have babies and children and all sorts of things, and we're very, very close as a team. And I think that being very close as a team and having developed this particular set of skills, as Liam Neeson in Taken now, but we have a particular set of skills and a particular certainly set of experiences and expertise in this area, and so we were definitely looking for options to keep working together and to ideally keep working in the same field, because you can imagine that anybody who's been working on a mature software application for a number of years is going to have that moment where they sort of throw their hands up and say, I wish we could just throw this all away and write it again from scratch. And that almost never happens, and it's a good thing that it almost never happens, because it's almost never a good idea. The road of software development is paved with the bodies of software projects where somebody thought, do you know what, this has all got a bit too much, let's start it again from scratch. And there are many books you can read on the subject of why it's a bad idea to start again from scratch. So I think if we'd stayed at Avid, no matter how much we might have wanted to, we never would have really been able to go back and change any of the fundamental decisions that we made, or that Ben and Jonathan made, even earlier, in the initial sort of conception of Sibelius. And of course, the other thing is that Sibelius being what started in really 1986 when they started working on it as schoolboys, and then 1993 when the first version that you could buy came out for the Acorn. So we're talking now 30 years, and the role of the modern musician who needs to work with scoring software has changed immeasurably in that 3 decades. At the time they started, they were looking at a way of producing a fair copy piece of music, a piece of music notation, in a way that was quicker and more efficient than the various manual methods that used at the time, whether that's engraving with punches on metal plates, or stenciling into double-size artwork that's then put in front of the camera, or even stuff that's done entirely by hand, or with a combination of dry lettering or music typewriters and hand lettering and this kind of stuff, all very, very manual processes. And so Sibelius was really intended to kind of do that job. You've already written your music, it's already arranged, now you just need to get it into effectively camera-ready artwork as quickly as you can. But of course it was so good and so quick at doing that, and they'd done such a good job of inventing ways of inputting the music and editing the music that felt so incredibly natural, that fairly soon composers started graduating towards using it as a composing environment. And then teachers started using it, and then they realized, hey, we could teach our kids how to use this, how to learn music theory using this. And so they started using it in classrooms. And then it started being used in media music, so music for film and TV and video games and musical theatre and these sorts of things. And then, of course, decades pass, and then virtual instruments and sample libraries start to become a thing, and then the internet starts to become a thing. In fact, those two things happen the other way around, but you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. And so the product has basically had to evolve to meet the needs of the growing needs, in some cases exponentially growing needs of different groups of musicians, in a way that Ben and Jonathan could never possibly have conceived in 1986, any more than Phil Farrand, who conceived a finale in around the same time in sort of 1987, 88, could possibly have foreseen. And so the big opportunity that we had with Dorico was to know what it is that are the so-called jobs to be done these days for a piece of music notation software, and to have the opportunity to try and design from the beginning a framework that would allow all of those jobs to be done as efficiently as possible, with sort of a place for everything and everything in its place.
This is really fascinating to me, especially your comment about how difficult it is to start from scratch. As an outsider, I've often wondered if a lot of the big tested and true software companies are sometimes running against themselves when trying to implement new features, whereas up-and-coming software developers are almost, in a sense, a little bit more nimble and able to more quickly develop. I think of, just coming back to my task manager of choice, Omnifocus. The Omni Group has been around for over 20 years. And, I run my life in my task manager, but now there's an influx of task managers. You can find, probably hundreds of them on the App Store, and they all have these really nice features. Web automation, collaborative features. And it's just funny. It's, I run into this, I guess I have this view that perhaps it's hard to go there when you have an application that's been so developed, that's built on this foundation that took years and years and years to build. Do you feel like there's some truth to that, or am I looking at this as an outsider?
No, you're absolutely right. Of course, in software development circles, we talk a lot about technical debt. Technical debt means things that you've done that need to be redone or that need to be updated, refactored. Refactoring being the process of taking code that works a particular way and keeping the same result, but making the way that the code works simpler or more modern or easier to maintain or more modular so that it can be reused, this kind of thing. And it's a huge challenge, I mean, even Dorico's only, we started working on it really in terms of coding it in early 2013, and now here we are at the end of 2017, and we already have written, 1 million plus lines of code from scratch. And that doesn't include the millions more lines of code that are in the application framework that we use in Qt, or the millions of lines of code that are in the audio engine from Cubase that Dorico is using as well. So, you already have thousands upon thousands of classes that do particular jobs, and the software fits together in a certain way. And so, yeah, absolutely. It's easier for us to add a feature to Dorico, particularly if it's one that we thought about when we were starting. And one of the things that is most fun for me is seeing Dorico week by week, month by month, come closer and closer to that initial vision that we articulated when we all sat together at the start of the project in our little basement office with no computers for the first few weeks, back in November and December of 2012. And here we are now at the end of 2017, and the product is still getting closer and closer to that initial vision. But because we had such a strong vision and we knew what was going to be needed to get there, we are really kind of building to a design that we set out to begin with. And I think that, there'll come a point, just like, anybody in, as you say, in the Omni group. I mean, that company's been around since the days of Steve Jobs' Next Step computers, the OS from the early 90s and so on. And so, yeah, they've again got this sort of legacy code. And no doubt that they've put a lot of time, just as we did when we were working on Sibelius, into being bold about refactoring things. You can't afford to let code just sit there. You can't afford to have bits of code that nobody in the team knows how they work because somebody's left, or because it wasn't well documented, or because it wasn't tested, particularly not if it was not unit tested, which means that the program itself knows how to test itself. So you actually code into the program what the result is supposed to be in a given situation, and then you run these tests every time you build the program. And if you get a different result, then you know that you've got a regression bug, and you have to fix it, or at least you have to investigate why the result has changed. And I'm certain that software developers like Omni, just like we at Steinberg do, put a lot of time into making sure that you're keeping on top of that technical debt, making sure the code doesn't get too old. I mean, by way of example, when we were working on Sibelius, the first big rewrite we did while I was there was to make the program Unicode compatible. Unicode, of course, being the sort of the means of describing every written language that known to man in a consistent way, using a consistent set of code points, which is references to particular locations within fonts and so on. And that was a huge rewrite. Then we had to rewrite the Mac version to go on to Mac OS X. Then we had to rewrite it again to move from Carbon to Cocoa and 64-bit. And so you have to go back and rewrite huge chunks of the program just to keep it up to date on the operating systems. And any kind of long-lived program, and Cubase is the same. Cubase started I think Cubase must be nearly 30 years old now, and it started in the mid-'80s on the Atari ST, itself a successor to earlier sequencers on the Commodore 64, and again it's been rewritten, not from scratch, but large chunks that have been refactored and re-architected at least 2 or 3 times in its 25-year plus history. So it is crucial that you do that. Because if you don't, then you find yourself not only unable to keep up with the progress of the operating system vendors like Microsoft and Apple, but also just unable to add features to the program because, that kind of long-lived code that nobody looks at, nobody understands, it effectively becomes ossified, it becomes hard. Even worse, I suppose, it becomes brittle. You can't change it because if you do, it will break, and you don't even know what it's going to break. So yes, maintaining programs over long periods of time is one of those. It's one of the key disciplines of software development, and I have the utmost respect for my colleagues in the team who really are able to keep this enormous cathedral that they have designed and built out of nothing. You know, it's a cathedral of pure abstraction, and yet they know exactly where every load-bearing pillar is, exactly what the keystone of every arch is, exactly how the glass fits in the windows, and they know that, and they keep that in their heads. You know, you have to be maintaining. A huge building like a cathedral requires maintenance continually, and it's the same with a large software application as well.
Wild. Such a different world. Well, and you know, it's great to hear that you've come into this world from the same background that you know, the people who I imagine are listening to this come from, which is, you know, a background of musicianship, and in the case of many of the people who are probably listening, teaching as well. So you had a few minutes ago like a really good segue into something I wanted to talk to, which is, I think we'll get into a little bit more like what someone who's looking at the software and kind of trying to figure out where this new application might fit into their workflow. You mentioned that the program is starting to come close to your vision, and I'm wondering, is that, when you say that, does this mean that the features that you want to be in the first version are almost there, or do you mean something different than that?
Yeah, I think it certainly does mean that. I mean, you know, it's no secret that when Dorico came out at the end of 2016, we didn't have everything in it that we had wanted to have in the first version that we released. And, you know, there's never a perfect time to release a new version of something. Doesn't matter whether it's the first version of something or the 10th version of something. You know, the world of software development means that in the end, you just have to kind of make a decision. Look, does this thing work? Okay, if it does, let's ship it. You know, it may not do everything that we originally wanted it to do, but it can do enough stuff that it's useful, and you just basically have to aim for a point in the end and then kind of go there and get the thing out. So that's what we did. And, you know, we've worked, I think we've maintained pretty much the same pace of development since that first release, because there are lots of things that we wanted to add. But I think that now with version 1.2, which came out at the beginning of December, we are, you know, a couple of big pieces that we expected to be there are not there at all. From that initial kind of plan. But I think that if we're realistic about it now, looking back on the plan that we formulated, you know, 4 years ago, we were kind of estimating our sort of the amount of effort that would need to be put in to get the results out as being like maintaining an existing application, rather than having to build the infrastructure for everything that you want to do from scratch. So, I mean, I don't want to get too boring about the intricacies of software development, but, you know, the thing is, when you're starting from a completely, you know, literally an empty project in your compiler, in your development environment, everything needs to be written from scratch. You know, you have to write every little bit, every tiny building block has to be written from scratch. And, you know, we made the decision early on to use Qt because that handles an awful lot of the building blocks for things about, you know, getting files in and out and drawing things on the screen and managing networking and, you know, lots of these very useful things, printing, fonts, all that stuff, that can all be handled by that. And you can then basically assemble your bits and bobs out of those building blocks. But all of the musical logic, the musical brain at the heart of Dorico, has to be constructed completely from scratch. There isn't any framework that you could find that would do the things that we wanted to do. And also because we had a new conception for how music should be stored, how it should be modeled inside the application, we basically had to build that from scratch. So every single time you want to do a feature, you have to build all of the foundational things that are required to get that feature to work. And I think we underestimated how much of that foundational work there would be in the first version. So as a result, some of the functional things that we thought would be there by the time we finished version 1.0 were just not there, and they're still not there now. But I think that what we have done by the time we get to version 1.2, which is more or less where we kind of draw a line under the first version, is we've articulated enough of that vision that hopefully people can see where we're going. And I've always said that there are really, three sort of main things that we wanted to achieve with Dorico, and I think we're now showing that we have achieved them or are on our way to achieving them. The first is that we wanted it to be really, really flexible, particularly in terms of the way that it thinks about music and the way that you input and edit the music. And we can talk a bit about these if you would like to. The second thing is that we wanted it to look beautiful. We really view, and this is partly down to me and other members of the team, we're all pretty nerdy about music engraving and about why things are done the way they're done and what it is about well-engraved music that makes it easier to read for musicians and why you can have smoother rehearsals and easier performances with the music laid out a certain way versus another way. So that was very important to us, and we wanted not only to surpass what computer engraving had done in the preceding few decades, including our own work on Sibelius, but also to get back to what real human craftsmen had done for hundreds of years, and the development of that craft of music engraving, with all of its subtle intertwining rules and things. We wanted to try and model those as well as we could, and I think we've really shown that we can do that, and that music produced by Dorico, even without any intervention from a person, looks so much closer to human engraved music than anything that's been possible on the computer before, that it's really quite striking. And the third thing is that we wanted it to sound great too. So we wanted it to be possible to use Dorico to produce mock-ups, all sorts of kind of high quality audio renderings and so on. And so in order to do that, we knew that we needed to start working on not only having, Cubase's audio engineering, which again is like the biggest stepping stone you can imagine, having this incredibly high-performance audio engine that's been honed by the world experts in terms of real-time audio performance and, efficiency in terms of running multiple tracks and things. And, of course, they invented the VST paradigm, this whole virtual instrument thing. That's a Steinberg invention. So for us to be able to stand on the shoulders of that achievement is really something in itself. But then to try and then, our job is then to try to build the bridge between the notation world and this kind of audio MIDI world in a way that makes sense, in a way that provides the control to the people who want it, the people who need to be able to produce these very detailed mock-ups, and at the same time being able to provide for people like me, for example. I'm not an audio guy. I'm not really a MIDI guy either. I'm a dots on staves kind of a guy. I need to be able to get a certain amount of playback out of it to check that I haven't written any notes wrong in my chord arrangements and things. So it has to be able to service that whole gamut of people there. So I think those three kind of big goals: it has to be flexible and easy to work with. It has to look better than anything else, and it has to have the power to sound better than anything else. I think we've gone a decent way towards realizing those. I think the third of them is the place where we still have the most work to do, because this sort of, I think looking back on our days at Sibelius in terms of features that everybody uses. Note input is one feature that everybody uses. Playback is another feature that everybody uses, even more than, say, use printing. Lots of people do stuff in scoring programs and never print it out. But playback is something that just about everybody uses to some degree or another. And I think over the years we probably received more bug reports and feature requests for playback than practically all other parts of the program combined. So playback is always the area where we have the furthest to go. But I think it's also the place where you can see inside Dorico how we intend to move that on.
That's really interesting. So I guess I want to pick at two of those things real quick. Your blog where you were documenting this process very, very beautifully captures this desire to make the music look great. I would love to just comment on the fact that I think, speaking not even about the notation itself, but just the software user interface looks great.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think, we were pretty sort of unashamed about where we took our inspiration from. Many of us in the team have a lot of admiration for Adobe Lightroom. It's an app that many of us use. And the thing that we really loved about Lightroom was that it was so obviously designed to be scalable, to work on the laptop when you're literally just grabbing pictures off the camera directly pretty much in the session to see what you've got on a better screen than the little, LCD on the back of your camera. And then all of these powerful organizational and batch processing things and all the wonderful things that Lightroom does. But it's also, works great when it's on a big screen or split across multiple screens, and the fact that it's got these collapsible panels and all these things. So we really sort of looked at that and thought that of all of the various different paradigms that were available to us that were going to work in a desktop setting and possibly also be adaptable for a more mobile setting later on down the road, having this kind of idea that the program had to be as efficient to use on a laptop as it is on your home studio computer was a real guiding principle for us, and that's why we ended up with a typography-based UI. So there's no bitmap graphics in Dorico's UI at all. It's all stuff from fonts. That's because it's future-proof and it's possible to scale to any resolution density that you might have on your your Retina MacBooks or on your Surface Pros on Windows that have very high DPI screens, or as people start to use more 4K external displays and things, that it would actually scale to all of those. And it needed to be, as I say, efficient on a single display, which is why all of the panels are collapsible. And that also was the thing, seeing what they call modules in Lightroom. That was what led us towards this notion of modes. I mean, that sort of builds to an extent on the work that I'd done in figuring out how the ribbon was going to work in Sibelius 7, because I think that ended up with 11 tabs. And it, again, the basic gist of it was from left to right, sort of roughly speaking, the linear process. I mean, it's not a linear process, but if you could imagine that making a musical score was a linear process, it would basically run from left to right through those panels, through those tabs rather, from kind of the basic notations that you need to create at the beginning to the reviewing and printing and viewing options at the very right hand side. And so we didn't want to do a ribbon in Dorico. We also didn't want floating palettes. We didn't want lots of floating windows. We wanted this kind of single window interface, but we also wanted to be able to clearly demarcate the different jobs to be done within the software. And so that's why we hit upon, borrowing the modules concept that Lightroom has, and then, sorting that out as what was originally only 4 modes. And I forget which one. I think it was print mode was the one that actually came last, and not for a good year or so after we'd had that initial conception of how the software was going to work. But it was very important to us that we figured that out right from the beginning. And so, myself and Anthony Hughes, who does all the voiceovers on the videos on the Dorico YouTube channel, which I thoroughly recommend if your listeners haven't checked them out.
I will say, on that subject, I really did in the beginning, and I'm a reckless early adopter, so I think I bought Dorico on the first day it launched.
Good for you.
Yeah.
And thank you.
You got it. I did, I did at first struggle with the new paradigm, and Sibelius, I've used Sibelius for so long. I mean, there are certainly moments, which we can get to in a little bit, where I take Sibelius out to do a quick task, and then I open Dorico back up. And the past year has marked sort of a flow. Like, okay, in my busy teaching schedule, I have our program is very, very intense. We have lots of after school things going on. Like, there's just not a lot of time to fit in. So there are these moments of like, okay, the friction of learning new software needs to subside for a moment. I'm going to take out a tool I know. And then a little bit of time opens up. And there was a point in the past year where a little bit of time opened up in my schedule, and I started digging into those YouTube videos, and everything opened. My mind opened, because they're so well produced. And I was skeptical at first because I'm a lynda.com subscriber, and I'm very spoiled by professional tutorials on computer software. And I must say that those YouTube videos are very concise, clear, helpful, and just very worth digging into if anyone listening is considering Dorico.
Yeah, I mean, Anthony does a great job, and I think part of the reason he does such a good job is that he was so, he and I worked very closely together on really kind of conceiving the user interface. And, we would sit for a long time and figure out, what is it that this mode has to be able to do? How should we do it? And then I would do some crummy pencil drawings, and then Anthony would go away, and he's got a really, really strong visual sense that he's really honed over the years that he's been working on Dorico. And I know he's never happy with how it looks, but I think he should be, because I think the product does look really smashing and really clear, and really, it's a very close sort of mapping between the way that we intend people to think about the program and the way that it's presented when you actually see it. And that's really all Anthony's work. He's done all of the visual design, all of the color schemes and everything, which, we started from the colors that we used in Cubasis, the iPad version of Cubase, and then used that as our kind of jumping off point. And, he's developed this whole visual language for Dorico over the last few years, which has been really, really great to see. And he's obviously, like everybody in the team, a tremendous asset to what Dorico has become. And I think, he's sort of almost surprised himself, I think, at how good these YouTube videos have been. But we sort of had a clear set of goals in mind for those. We've got these issues around, we don't have particularly complete documentation for the product yet. And so the YouTube videos are really kind of designed to solve that problem as best we can. And so we wanted to make sure that they would be very much to the point, very concise, very clear and easy to follow in terms of the way they present, the way to use the program. And I think, Anthony's just knocked them all out of the park consistently. And, he's got a bunch more coming. There's a big series on page layouts and engrave mode, which will be going up in the new year. And he's already working on a series on play mode. So, and of course, we are also working on more sort of traditional documentation as well. And I think a big chunk of that's going to be published before Christmas, with more to come in the new year. So I think, people like you, Robbie, who've taken the program on in this early stage when, it doesn't have a completely fleshed out feature set. It doesn't have every bit of help available to you in terms of documentation, tutorials, and so on. I think it's pretty great that you've done that at all, and likewise the other several thousand people who've taken to Dorico so far. But I think it's only going to get better in that direction, I think. But hopefully, what we're doing with these tutorials and the documentation is kind of elucidating something that is hopefully somewhat apparent from the software. But again, because as you alluded to, yourself and many other people are already pretty well able to use another scoring program, whether it's Sibelius or Finale or something else. The biggest challenge of all, particularly when you don't have any documentation or other material to help guide your, what your expectations should be about just how different it is understanding what the differences are and then knowing how to work around them or work with them.
I would say that the YouTube videos are so accessible that I would almost recommend a new user just watch them rather than start digging through the existing documentation. I mean, they were so helpful. One of the things that I really love, and I call it superficial, but I was just really ready for a user interface that looked modern and clean and had maybe could improve my note input workflow. And I have to say, I've said it already, but Dorico looks really great. And now that I know that you are behind the ribbon interface in Sibelius 7, I have to hesitate to talk about my feelings about it.
Believe me, that was so unpopular with existing users when we released that. That particular user interface paradigm was so unpopular that I have heard literally I've had many curses rained down on me by people who discovered that it was my idea. Lots of people like to give me the benefit of the doubt and think, oh, Avid made them do that. But no, we thought we should do that, and I worked on it for months to design it, and then a couple of members of the team worked on it for a year to implement it, and then, a lot of people hated it. But I'll tell you why we did it, and that's because, by contrast with Dorico's interface, if you remember back to what Sibelius's interface was like before the ribbon, the user interface itself showed you nothing of what the program was capable of. And in a way, that minimal user interface is very powerful for an existing user, because then you have relatively little clutter to get in the way of your efficient use of the software. Although I will say that by the time we got to version 6, I think Sibelius had something like 11 or 12 floating windows, mixer, navigator, keypad, ideas window, transport window, etc., etc., etc. And that started to make the program rather unwieldy. But in terms of imagining yourself as a new user sitting down to use Sibelius for the first time, let's say at the beginning of 2011, when the program is 13 years into its Windows incarnation, 18 years into its sort of Acorn and Windows incarnation, so much software, so many features have been built into the software, and yet the user interface shows you, new, open, save, undo, redo. A couple of buttons that we added to the toolbar each version, they would shuffle around. Whichever feature we thought needed to be added, we added the highlight feature in version 3, so that had better go on the toolbar. Oh, we added, whatever it might be. Or we added the pitch spectrum feature in version 2, that had better go on the toolbar. We literally took the view that the toolbar was a way of advertising new features that the program had, rather than actually providing any kind of consistent or logical approach to how you might approach learning the software. So by the time you get to version 6, and if you've been using Sibelius for 12 years, you've not noticed this accretion of all of this stuff that we've been adding over the years. You just every time a new version comes out, there's a couple more shortcuts to learn. A couple of menus get even longer. We had some very famously long menus in Sibelius with 30, 40 levels or items, and then 2 or 3 levels of sub menus and so on. And you just kind of assimilate that, and you're good to go. But you imagine yourself as starting to use Sibelius for the very first time in 2011, and yes, okay. The fact that it has a very uncluttered user interface is very appealing, but actually finding out how to do anything is almost impossible. And so that was the motivation behind the ribbon. The goal was to upset existing users' workflow as little as possible, so all of the existing keyboard shortcuts will remain, and it would be possible to hide the ribbon straight away, and you could just work with it closed as if you literally had no toolbar at all, and to then surface all of the different areas of functionality that Sibelius was able to provide in terms of the different notations it has and all the rest of it. Put all of that in right up in that ribbon, so that in order to work out much more of what the program could do, all you had to do was click through the ribbon. And then we added things like find in ribbon to help you find things, and that we followed the Microsoft guidelines on having the keyboard acceleration and so on. And where we went wrong, because we clearly didn't get it completely right, and where we went wrong was that we underestimated the number of people who were reliant on the menus. So if you knew the shortcuts, you were fine, and if you were just a sort of hunt and peck person with the mouse, you were fine. But if you were the kind of person who had really memorized the path through a menu to a particular area, whether it's system break or lock format or house style, whatever it was going to be, then now you were really in the shtuck, because now those muscle memories have to be relearned. And likewise, if you're a Windows user and you were used to those kind of Alt and then a letter to get into a menu and then another letter to choose a menu item, that was all still possible, but they were all different because they were now organized differently and the menus weren't there anymore. So, and as I say, one of the things that kind of bugged me and the others in the team a bit after we were gone from Avid is that, they were sort of going around saying, oh, this wasn't as successful, blah, blah, blah. In fact, it was much more successful than the previous version, and the goal had been to encourage new users to try the software, and to make it easier for new users to get going with the software. And, we made the calculus that, look, yes, Sibelius is a mature product, but we still have to believe that there is still a greater opportunity ahead of us for selling to new customers than there is simply to sell to existing customers. And that was something that Ben and Jonathan always instilled in me as well, is that you should never be afraid. If you have a good reason for changing something that an existing user might rely on, you shouldn't be afraid to do it, because if you don't do it, then what you're doing is you're basically saying that once you've made a decision once, you can never make it any differently again, even if you come up with a much better way of doing something. And I think that you can actually look at Sibelius and Finale, and you can see those two approaches written large. We in Sibelius land were never afraid to change things, even if they're very controversial. You know, I remember in Sibelius 4 changing it such that space, which had previously always put in a rest, now started and stopped playback, which is what all sequences and doors do, because we wanted to put more of an emphasis on playback. And existing users absolutely howled in protest at that, but I still think it was the right thing to do. And Finale, by contrast, has still got many of the same workflows that it had in its very first version. I mean, even down to the fact that some of the tools have still got the same basic icon and so on as its very first version in 1988. And you know, I suppose the other way of looking at it is you can say, in that case, well, Sibelius and that approach of changing things that are established in the software, that's the Apple way. And the approach of kind of keeping everything working as far as you can to upset existing users as little as possible, that's the Microsoft way, because I think that is also how you can look at Apple's OS developments and their software developments versus Microsoft, although of course Microsoft then did throw everything up in the air in a pretty big way with Windows 8, and they're still sort of working their way back from that. But I think, you know, up to that point you could say that those two philosophies were kind of embodied that way. So, you know, I'll take my lumps on the ribbon. It succeeded in the ways that it needed to, which was to make the program accessible to new users. I do regret that we didn't come up with a better answer for those users who were very menu heavy, who, you know, really relied on those. But you know, I still see people today still using Sibelius 6 because they just couldn't get over the hump of looking at a new UI. And I understand it. You know, that's a tool. As I say, you develop this muscle memory. It's like somebody reversing the order of the keys on a piano when you've been playing the piano for 20 years. You know, so I do get it, but I think that we have to be brave. We in software development have to be brave. If we really think that there is a better way to do something, we can't be afraid to change it. Because if we are afraid to change it, the result is software that can't evolve and that can't develop and grow as the users of the software grow, as the needs of the software grow.
It makes a lot of sense. It really does. And I will say that I have used Sibelius recently enough where I think the part of the bar that makes the most sense to me as someone who identifies more as a power user is that find option. I mean, the find works very, very well. I'm actually curious, what do you think in Dorico, if anything, is the most like that little search find bar for finding where certain features and tools are in the software?
Well, I don't think we have anything like that, in fact, in Dorico, because we've, I mean, I'm sure that over time we may well need something like that. But from the beginning, we tried to, I mean, when we did the ribbon in Sibelius, we were kind of taking this vast array of things the program already did and trying to change it as much as we had to, but no more than we had to, if you see what I mean. Whereas when we came to designing Dorico, of course, we already knew pretty much what was we have a roadmap for features that goes out quite a few years, and we designed where those features were going to fit in right from the outset. So hopefully the way that we've sort of set Dorico up, it's kind of got this internal logic to itself that means that it doesn't take you very long to figure out that, because, you know, the maximum number of places you can go to look for something is basically in the right-hand panel, in the left-hand panel, in the bottom panel, or in the menus. That's it. There's nowhere else you really ever have to go. And I think that where we do still have some possible overlap or confusion is what things are in the edit menu, say, versus what things are in properties. But really, the goal with the design and separating things into the different modes was that, you know, you would very quickly assimilate where things go. And to give you a specific example, by contrast with Sibelius, in Sibelius, you know, one of the things that we learn early on when we're using the program, without really kind of questioning it, is that dynamics are two different types of things in Sibelius. You've got expression text, which you do with Control-E, and then you hold down the Control key and type, you know, Control-N, Control-F for mezzo forte, whatever it might be. While hairpins are lines, and they're not, you know, and in fact, the really remarkable thing about this, and if you think about this for a moment, maybe you've never thought about it, but excuse me. Dear me, excuse me. The word dynamics never appears in Sibelius's interface except in relation to filtering them. if you go looking for dynamics, for creating dynamics, in fact, if you even type dynamics into that find and ribbon thing, you won't get to the bit that allows you to create dynamics. And that's because Sibelius is actually organized generically rather than musically. It's organized around things that are alike in terms of their appearance on the page or their simplicity to program. So in Sibelius, you've got basically notes, and then everything that isn't a note or a stave or something like that is either a line, in which case it could be a slur or an octave line or a hairpin or a tempo, a gradual tempo change or whatever it might be, or a text item, in which case it's a tempo but not a gradual tempo, an immediate tempo, or a reset tempo, or it's a dynamic but not a gradual dynamic, an immediate dynamic like piano or forte, or it's a playing instruction or whatever it might be, or it's a symbol. And that's kind of how everything in Sibelius has to work, that everything has to fall generically into one of those categories. But that's fine from a computer programming point of view, and it's even okay as a user because nearly everything in Sibelius has a fairly thoughtful shortcut. So if you take the time to learn the shortcuts, very quickly it doesn't bother you that Control E creates text and H creates hairpins. But we didn't want to go down that generic route when we were designing Dorico. We instead wanted to organize everything musically, which means that dynamics should all be grouped together. There should be the word dynamics should appear in the user interface. All of the dynamics should be grouped together, and they should be able to be input in a consistent fashion that works for dynamics, regardless of whether they are texty looking things or liney looking things. And we tried to follow that through for everything that we've done in Dorico, so that never mind whether or not it's easy for us to program. In fact, I can tell you that we've very often chosen things that are very difficult to program, almost, I wonder, in a kind of masochistic or even perverse fashion. But always in goal, the end goal is to make the result, the program, easier for musicians to use, more closely allied to their needs, more musical in its design and in the way it's thinking, so that you can. I think we always said with Sibelius, it's the program designed by musicians for musicians, and that was true. We were musicians, we are musicians, and we did design it for musicians. But I think that we were doing that with a certain compromise that was sort of made early on, that we sort of then had to, a Faustian bargain that we had to deal with forever about the kind of generic approach that was taken when Ben and Jay first started building it. We've no doubt made some other Faustian pact, the implications of which we are not yet fully aware when we designed Dorico, but up front what we were trying to do was never mind what might be easy, what might allow us to reuse stuff more. Never mind that. Think instead about what does the musician want to see? How does it need to work from the musician's point of view to make it really clear and really easy?
Yeah, so interesting. So for me, booting up the software for the first time, I think the paradigm of sort of how you have, what would you describe as the technical term for how you have these different modes? What does Lightroom call that?
Well, yeah, they call them modules, but
okay.
we really do just call them modes, because I think a module makes it sound like something you could take out and put back in, or you could change them. Whereas I think really in Dorico, it's kind of it is more like the essential things that you are going to need to do. You're going to have to add players and instruments to your project. You're going to have to specify what pieces of music they're playing. You're going to need to write some stuff, et cetera, et cetera. So we really, we call them modes because they are, and you never know. We might add more than the 5 that we have today. Although I think that it's a pretty solid breakdown of that sort of process. But yeah, it's really about those 5 phases of working on a project together.
The only one that tripped me up at first was the differentiation between writing and engraving, but I have to say that the software does a really smart job knowing when I want to do something. For example, I believe it's if I double-click into the middle of where some of my notation is while I'm in engrave mode, it'll really quickly snap back into write mode, knowing that I intend to put a note there.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we wanted it. We wanted the, it was important to us that the separate modes were separate and they did different jobs. But it was also important to us that there wasn't too much friction involved in moving back and forth between the different modes. So, yeah, I don't think there's any way of switching automatically into engrave mode, but certainly you can switch automatically out of setup mode and out of engrave mode, like you say, by doing certain interactions with the music that suggest, hey, I want to actually input something now, and the program will take your hint and it will go straight into write mode so that you can do that immediately.
I mean, if someone clicks on a a marking, like they have a piano underneath a measure, I don't know what the technical limitations would be of perhaps trying to snap into a mode where they could immediately start dragging that. That seems to kind of have a friction against the way things have been designed.
Well, I think the way that you think about that, though, is that, or the way that I would encourage you to think about it, is that there's two different kinds of dragging you can do. Again, if you imagine with your Sibelius head on, you put a dynamic in, you put a piano in or something, and then as you drag it around, in Sibelius you're doing two things at once. You're both adjusting its graphical position relative to its current attachment point, and you are, once you drag it far enough, going to attach it somewhere else. And that's actually really bad, in my opinion, because what that means is that it's very, very easy, unintentionally, because you're not looking closely. Excuse me. It's very easy, if you're not looking closely, to drag that dynamic, for example, onto another stave, which then creates enormous problems. It still looks like it's graphically near the stave that it was originally attached to, but now it's actually attached to another stave, which means that when you do part extraction, you've got one part that doesn't show that dynamic at all, and another part that shows a spurious extra dynamic that didn't mean to be there. So we really, the way to think about the separation between write mode and engrave mode in Dorico is that in write mode, you can change the meaning of the music. So you can drag that dynamic, and you do drag the dynamic, and it drags to a different rhythmic position. So it doesn't move at all until you drag the mouse far enough that now the dynamic belongs to another rhythmic position, and you can't drag it to another stave. If you want to do that, you've got to cut it and you've got to paste it, or you've got to delete it and make it again. Whereas if you're in engrave mode, you can drag that dynamic literally any way you like. You can drag it off, completely to a different place on the page, but musically speaking, that dynamic still belongs at the place to which it's attached in write mode. And I think that once you actually learn that is the way the program is designed, that actually becomes extremely liberating, because it means that you can now have complete confidence that you cannot introduce an unintentional error in either mode. You can neither drag it such that it looks like it's in the wrong place in write mode, nor can you drag it in such a way in engrave mode that it's going to end up in somebody else's part by accident.
Yeah, it actually is it makes so much sense. I guess my question is there a way to initiate that change of mode that doesn't involve clicking, into I already forgot the word you used. That was not modules.
Modes, yeah.
Modes, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think possibly, but the challenge that we always have there is that, we already are using so many of the modifier keys on the keyboard,
sure.
to do things. And we again have rules like the arrow keys on their own can't edit anything, so you can only ever navigate with the arrow keys. There's another thing that always seemed a bit weird to us in Sibelius. In fact, we seriously considered changing it, but this was the one time that I can remember where we just thought, no, we'll have people turning up at our door with torches and pitchforks if we do this, so we never did it. But if you think about it, in Sibelius, left and right arrow keys just hop between different notes, but up and down, they don't hop between different notes. They change the pitch of the note that you've got selected. That's completely inconsistent, and also completely inconsistent with how, say, a cursor works in a word processor. It's not like you move left and right through the words with left and right, and then when you press up and down arrow, a letter A changes to a letter B or to a letter Z or something. That's not how they work. So we wanted to make again, to remove the chance that you could accidentally edit the music in Dorico without intending to, the arrow keys on their own just navigate. They cannot edit the music, which means that then you have to accidentally hold down the Alt key and the arrow keys in order to actually make any changes. And as I say, that obviously my point there is it's very difficult to do that accidentally. To say Alt up arrow to make the note go up by a step, you can almost not do that by accident. That can only be done intentionally. So again, it's all about wanting to make all of those features still very much available at your fingertips, but to eliminate all of the little ways that you might not think about. You sort of might think of using a program like Sibelius as having all this freedom. I can drag staves around, I can drag dynamics around, and never have to think about anything. But in fact, what you're doing most of the time is creating errors, and you certainly have at all times the opportunity for great errors. And so obviously we spend a lot of time to try to make sure that Dorico puts things in the right place anyway. So you don't need to drag staves around, for example. Staves always space completely automatically in Dorico. You don't need to drag them. We make sure that dynamics are positioned perfectly by default, etc., etc., so you don't need to drag them. And so the idea then becomes more like you, as the user of the software, you communicate your musical intention to the software, and it enacts them in the best way that it knows how, with all of these hundreds of configurable options and properties that allow you to influence the decisions that it makes. And you don't have to get down and dirty with the nitty-gritty detail. The program can do all of that on its own. And I think that is really a sea change between Dorico and Sibelius. Dorico is more like, tell me what you mean and I will do what you want me to do. Sibelius is more like, I'm not really clever enough to know what you mean, but I give you plenty of rope to hang yourself with, and you can drag things around until they're in the right place. Hopefully they're still attached to the right staves. Hopefully they're still at the right rhythmic positions. They're going to play back correctly. But, kind of, that's up to you, Mr. User. And we've tried to sort of swing the other way a bit with Dorico.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So you said play mode, which is one of the modes we haven't talked about in detail yet. You said there's some more YouTube documentation coming on that subject, and you said that that's one of the modes that you feel in the near future is going to be more fully, more so fulfilling the vision that you originally had. Can you tell me a little bit about that? I mean, I certainly am getting my head around play mode these days, but in the first time I opened it up, I didn't know what to do with it at all. I just saw a grid of colorful squares, and it just...
Yes, I like to just open play mode and look at the grid of colourful squares, to be honest.
They're beautiful.
They are very nice to look at. So you open a nice big score that's got lots of instruments in it, and it gives you a very attractive sort of display of colourful squares, which is good. No, I mean, I think the goal for play mode is really, as I say, we have this sort of tension with the playback features in the program, that it needs to be able to work for people like me, who is a complete idiot when it comes to the MIDI side of things, and I just want to be able to make sure that it sounds correct. For my own needs, they're very modest because I'm just doing myself choral arranging or keyboard arranging, that kind of stuff, and so I don't need to hear wonderfully realistic orchestral sounds. Everything's going to get, in the end, tested by my choir. Probably the same day I'm doing it, because I've left it till the last minute as usual, and I'm too busy working most of the time to actually do any musical stuff. But but obviously there's a whole gamut of people who rely on playback features in scoring programs, and really the goal with play mode is to move the line between where the features of your scoring program become not enough in terms of the tweakability, the configurability of how it sounds, and where you then have to move over to a DAW like Cubase or another one of the sequencers or DAWs. And it's to really move that line further into the distance, so that you can do more of that work inside the scoring program. So, what don't we mean by that? Well, we don't think you'll be recording, multi-track audio into Dorico in the near future. We don't think you'll be, running 50 or 100, 1,000 tracks of audio alongside your MIDI tracks. But what I think it does include is more detailed MIDI editing. So right now, of course, you can do basic, note duration editing and note offset duration sort of stuff. You can have these two modes in play mode between the notated duration, which means that as you drag the notes left and right, they're actually moving in time. And if you were looking at write mode at the same time, you would see the notes either, moving forward or moving backwards and becoming longer or shorter and being renotated pretty much the way that a sequencer's score editor like Cubase's one works. And then it has the other mode, which is the play durations mode, where you can drag the start of the note or the end of the note left or right, and that only affects their playback position rather than their notated position, which is very useful for tricking a virtual instrument into triggering a legato thing or something, because the two notes overlap, or if a note becomes much shorter, then it will automatically trigger a particular staccato sound or something,
which is brilliant. I remember my taking an orchestration class in graduate school, and the professor talking about having, by the end of his project, 4 different versions of his score in Sibelius, and one of them was for writing, one of them was to make sure that the parts looked beautiful, one of them was to make sure that the score looked beautiful, and one of them was to make sure that it played back correctly.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there you go. In a nutshell, that's exactly what we're trying to solve. You should be able to do all 4 of those things in Dorico with the same score. That is absolutely our goal. So, Play Mode today, it has a piano roll. As of the version we released a couple of weeks ago, it has a simple drum editor as well, which is quite fun. And we also enabled both the draw tool and the drumstick tool in version 1.2. So you can actually now draw notes into the piano roll, which you couldn't do until recently. And you can also input your drum notes directly onto the percussion tracks as well. But there's an awful lot more that we have planned. There's both in terms of direct manipulation of the data in Play Mode, so you can expect in the future, I can't say when exactly, but certainly you can expect in the future to have controller lanes. So you'll have a global one for tempo, and then maybe a per instrument one for dynamics that would automatically convert between the continuous controllers that you use for sustaining instruments and the velocity, note on velocity that you would use for percussive instruments. That would all be handled automatically. And of course, if you have an instrument that can do both, like a violin that can be both plucked and bowed, it would automatically know how to convert that dynamic appropriately. You can also imagine proper parametric automation of your VST parameters and also of your MIDI controllers. So again, we're now talking about the sorts of editing that you would do in your DAW in order to get, a particular playing technique to be triggered correctly, or maybe you might record, you might sort of play in some notes in real time on your keyboard and then do another pass over it in real time and ride one of the controller knobs in order to kind of give a bit more expression and so on. And those sorts of edits will then start to become possible in Dorico. At the same time, we also already have this complete audio mixer with a full signal chain. You've got inserts, you've got sends. We want to continue to grow the flexibility of the mixer so that you can also perhaps even bring presets from one project to another, so that if you find that if I tweak the EQ on the clarinet just so, then I find that it really sort of works in this texture, and then you'd be able to kind of bring those settings between projects. And of course, the other side of it that isn't so directly related to actually kind of getting your fingers dirty with knobs and faders and dragging things with the mouse and so on, is the whole VST Expression Map side of thing, which is how the program knows what the capabilities are of your virtual instrument, of your sound library, and knows how that when you write a particular playing technique in the music, like pizzicato or arco or harmonic or any number of percussion techniques or whatever it might be, how to translate that into the appropriate sound in your virtual instrument. And we have that already to a reasonable degree in Dorico as it stands today, but there's still quite a lot more that we will do to make the sort of prioritization of, what do I do if I'm asking for muted pizzicato, but I don't have both muted pizzicato, I have either of them but not both together, so should I prefer pizzicato or should I prefer mute? And putting more of that control in the user's hands, so that you can really have a better idea, how the various sounds that are provided by your virtual instrument are going to be used by the software, so that all the things that you do by hand in your sequencer, where you create your extra track because now you've got to have this key switch to trigger this thing, and so you end up with your 12 or 15 tracks just for one violin line. The idea is that we want to get that all in one track in Dorico, all on one stave, all driven from playing techniques and all driven via VST expression maps. So I think that the future for that stuff is, there's almost no end in sight to what we can do there, but the sort of medium-term goal is to provide that kind of MIDI editing, that kind of controller automation, and that kind of flexibility in handling VST expression maps and therefore playing techniques and articulations, that the line at which you have to then say, do you know what, I've gone as far as I can in my scoring program, I've now got to basically fork this project and have the notation over here and have the audio over here. We want to move that line ideally so that you don't have to switch over to a DAW at all, but at least to move it much, much later in the process.
Wow. Well, since we're talking about some play mode features that are coming, in preparation for this meeting, I actually posted to Facebook, there is a group called I Teach Music Technology. And I was curious, I thought to myself, maybe some people will have some questions that I didn't think about. And nearly all of them were related to either questions about why a certain thing works a certain way, or when is a certain feature coming that I need to get my work done. And a lot of the features that were mentioned when I inquired were really things that I had seen that you had mentioned already in various different, on the YouTube channel and on Twitter, things that I had seen that were coming down the road. I guess I'm wondering, like, in the next point release, like, what are some of the things that people asked about were, the really big one was jazz articulations, slash chords. When are, like, can you spout off the top of your head, like, do you just have sort of in your mind, like, what are some of the, I guess I would call these like low-hanging fruit kinds of things that are in the immediate development cycle?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to be concrete about it because, as we speak now, a week before Christmas or so, we've kind of just finished version 1.2. We're looking at doing one more little bug fix update. There've been a couple of little bits and bobs that have come up since the update came out on the 5th that we need to fix. So we're sort of looking at the short-term fixes and a few little changes that need to be made to that. But really, until January, when we sit down and we actually start planning, we sat down together as a team on Monday this past week, and I outlined to the team what I thought were the things that we needed to work on next. And they certainly include things like, jazz articulations, rhythmic slashes, absolutely, kind of almost number one with a bullet, really, those particular things. And, we start to now think about, well, how are we going to prioritize these and how are we going to get them in? It would be nice to think that we could work forever on updates that we could give away free to our existing users, but we can't. It would be nice to think that we can take as long as we like for the next major version of the program, but we can't. So what we are now in the position of doing is looking at the schedule that we would like to get to, because there's definitely certain times of year that it makes sense to release. For example, a paid version of the product in order to hit, particular customers who are thinking about buying software at certain times of year. So we want to get onto a particular release cadence, which means that at some point or another we're going to have to, take a bit of a hit in terms of what we can work on in order to make sure that we're driven to a particular date. So once we get back after Christmas, and this is all very cryptic, I realise, but that's the future of prognostication, is just saying vague things. It's like your horoscope. I can tell you that you'll meet a tall, dark, handsome stranger, and you'll believe me. It's basically we will sit down in January. As I say, I've outlined to the team the things that I would like us to be working on, and once we get back after the new year, we will sit down and we will figure out which things we can actually do. And we probably won't say in concrete terms what we're going to work on exactly. But, I've become quite adept at dropping hints over the past many years. So if you, keep an eye on the things that I wrote about on the blog or the things that I say on the forum or on Twitter, then I think you'll get a reasonable idea of where we're going. Sounds good.
I'm going to ask you my favorite question I've been looking forward to, and I don't know what you'll have to say about it. I over the past few years, have tried, and sometimes have succeeded, to make my iPad become a real productive tool for me. And this has been, I have taken some big steps forward since things like the iPad Pro have been released, and the recent iOS 11 update has brought many troubles, but it has also brought a proper file management system that seems to be getting traction with third-party file providers, and dragging and dropping, and some of these things that you would expect from a Mac. And I know things are very different on the Windows tablet side of things, as it runs, the full version of Windows, maybe not with the same processing power, depending on what kind of device you have. But all of this is just to say, there are a few pieces of software where I run into a little bit of friction. And one of them is, I have not found a DAW that I really love on my iPad. I use Logic on my Mac. I would love if there was something that could even just let me drag an audio region a little bit to the left or the right, or make a cut, but it's GarageBand for now. And the other major one tends to be my score editor, my notation editor. So, with the advent of hardware and software changes to iOS in particular, but I mean, you can certainly speak more generally to tablets and the whole mobile market space. What has been or is on your mind about the future of mobile and Dorico?
Yeah, I mean, I think we definitely want to do something on mobile with Dorico, no question about it. And, again, the way that we've approached the development of the software from the very beginning was to leave the door open to working on mobile. And we've even done some, before we got version 1 out the door, we even had some experimental sort of building of the core libraries and so on iOS and even on Android at that point to make sure that we were not closing off the possibility of doing any mobile stuff. I mean, I think the challenge is still that, economically it's quite problematic developing software of the capability of Dorico for devices like the iPad Pro. People will buy their iPad Pro with their Apple Pencil, and they will spend happily $1,000 on such a thing. But then you suggest to them that they might want to pay for software that's any more than like $3.99, and they go bananas. Which I find so utterly crazy. And I think that Apple haven't helped us independent software vendors by selling, for example, GarageBand on the iPad for $2.99 from the very moment that came out. It immediately sets in this whole new market that they've created for software on the iPad since 2010 the expectation that mobile software, mobile first software, is free or cheap, and that makes it very difficult for companies like Steinberg, who've got limited development resources, to say, well, do you know what? Yeah, we can divert, a sizable chunk of our development resources onto this platform and then sell it for $2, because the challenge is that, although music is not, it's not like music is a minority. I mean, it's a minority interest, but it's not like you have to have studied for 20 years, like to become an airline pilot or something, and so you've got these very, very specific tools that can command a higher price for people like, airline pilots who can have all of their maps and their flight plans and everything on there, or possibly I imagine that in other similar fields of work, like maybe the law and medicine and so on, there are similarly very specialized things. But music doesn't quite fall into that niche where there's a community of people who absolutely must have this thing in order to do their job, and so therefore they can command a higher price for it. Musicians, music teachers, they tend not to have enormous amounts of money. They tend to be, time poor as well, which means that they're splitting their activities between lots of other things. So, when Apple come along and say, yes, well, to have a music creation tool that can do recording and multi-track recording and MIDI and virtual instruments and so on, and we're going to sell it on the iPad for $2.99, it really makes it very, very difficult for companies like us to get in there. Just because, if we were to come in, and of course Steinberg makes Cubasis, and Cubasis is its list price on the iPad is $50, and we've sold a good bunch of them. It's a successful product, but it's obviously not a mass market product the way that GarageBand is at $2.99, and so and I think Cubasis may well provide a good model for what we might do with Dorico in the future. Cubasis is able to, it's not actually, strictly speaking, using much of the desktop Cubase code, but it's project compatible with desktop Cubase. So you can import and export projects between Cubasis on the iPad and Cubase on the desktop, and it's a lot more advanced than GarageBand. It's considerably more advanced, and in fact the new version of Cubasis that just came out even now includes plugins from Waves for the first time on iOS, which is pretty amazing. So
that's interesting. So wait, they've developed them specifically for your software?
Exactly. So so some of Waves' key algorithms are now running inside plugins in Cubasis on the iPad, and it also now, I think the previous big release of Cubasis included time stretching and all these sorts of things with some of the same algorithms that are used on the desktop. So the audio quality of something like Cubasis on the iPad is much, much higher than what you can do with GarageBand, and it's much more of a DAW. You can record, you can do MIDI. It's all there. Certainly if you're looking for a better DAW for your mobile device, if you haven't checked out Cubase, you really should. And as it happens, there's also, because this new update with the Waves plugins just came out, it's also on special offer, and I think it's 50% off in the App Store at the moment. So that might be something definitely worth checking out if you've only gone as far as GarageBand. But I think Cubasis may well provide us with a model of what we might do. It's not a $5 product. It's not even a $10 product. It's a $50 product. And so if we can find a way to develop a version of Dorico for the iPad that makes sense, and that we think we can sell for that kind of money, then it becomes a possibility. But it still has to compete for priority with our limited development resources against everything else that we're doing. And so I think in the short term, maybe even in the short to medium term, because we've still got a lot of work to do on the desktop version of Dorico in terms of filling out, when you write to your I'm a music teacher group and they come back to you and say, oh, when is X or Y feature? The thing that's most interesting is when is X or Y feature coming? Then that's a good indication that really that has to be our priority for the short term at least. And I'm sure we will be doing some explorations into the world of mobile and how Dorico can play a part in the world of mobile, but it's not something that we can work on immediately.
Yeah, what you're saying is the story of software development all around. It's a problem. It's a major iOS problem. I don't think that it's great on the Mac either, and I don't know I don't know enough about the App Store on Windows to really comment. But it is they are not, Apple in particular is not doing much to help advance professional software on iOS, plain and simple.
Yep, I think that is fair, and I think that it's a similar story on Windows because in order to get stuff into the Windows Store, you actually have to write your software using particular APIs and approaching that whole thing in a particular way. This Universal Windows Platform (UWP), and existing applications maybe don't make sense always 100% to be rejigged in that way to run under this sort of UWP thing. So there's a lot of challenges, but there's also, of course, a lot of opportunity. And it's not like mobile devices like the iPad, like the iPhone, are going to go away anytime soon. But I think at the same time, you can read in the broader technology press about how, desktop and laptop, desktop computers basically stopped being sold, if you believe the tech press, about 5 years ago, and now laptops are horribly on the decline as well, and pretty soon everybody's just going to use their smartphone in their pocket. And I think that may, if you look at it at the highest level, 50,000 feet view, that might be true. But I think that when you're talking about specialist creative pursuits or other specialist pursuits, whether it's scientific pursuits or legal or medical pursuits, that I think that a more specifically targeted device like a desktop computer, like a laptop computer, is still going to be crucial simply because of the efficiencies that having a multimodal input method gives you. I can use on my computer here in front of me, I'm sitting in front of my Mac Mini, I've got my Magic Trackpad, I've got my keyboard, I've got a MIDI keyboard, so I can't use touch, okay, fine. But actually, my computer keyboard and my MIDI keyboard are so well optimized for the kind of input that I might want to do in a software like Dorico that I don't want to use touch, because these things are much better and much more specific. I may not have a 10-inch touchscreen in front of me, but I've got a 27-inch high-resolution monitor in front of me, which allows me to see more of my work. So I think that as long as there are these pursuits that are more detailed, that require more involvement from the user, that are a sort of a higher-order activity than scrolling through Instagram or doing a nice sketch on a single piece of canvas, in your iPad with your pencil or whatever, which is not to demean those activities. Those have value. It's just to say that there are another set of activities for which that particular form factor and that particular input method isn't the most optimal one. And so those of us who are still writing professional software we don't need to be browbeaten or herded onto the iPad as the one true future of computing, because I think it's clear, and you look at the shipments of MacBooks and indeed Macs in general, and they buck the trend. They go against this kind of falling shipments of desktop and laptop computers, and that's because those are the computers being bought by the people who've got specific jobs to do. The laptops that people were buying 5 years ago for browsing the web and posting on Facebook, that job has been taken over by the smartphone, and quite right too. It's better for that. Why should you have to have a device that that has to sit in your lap at home? Why can't you have a device that you can be using on the train, or while you're walking the streets, or while you're whatever? The smartphone is a revolutionary device in that category. But I think it's a fallacy to say that all sort of content creation, all sorts of detailed jobs are going to be done on those types of devices, because they're clearly not optimal. And I hear what you're saying, of course, Robbie, about, well, you would like to be able to make more productive use of your iPad. And so I think that the challenge then to us as software developers is to take the products that we've built for the desktop modality and all of these different input methods and large displays and so on, and discover what is the essential thing that does make sense on that form factor. But that's an interesting design and philosophical challenge to us as software designers. But what it can't answer is, okay, well, if you assume that the activity that you do on the mobile device is going to be complementary to the main activity that you're doing on the desktop application, then at that point your possible user base is some percentage of your existing desktop user base. And maybe, of course, there's a halo effect. Some people come to you from the mobile device, but basically it doesn't become a mass market proposition, which means then we're back to the same thing we were talking about a few minutes ago about how the race to the bottom in terms of software pricing make it very difficult to invest heavily in that experience for the users who would like it.
That reminds me of another thing that I'm curious about. In this year, ending 2017, and with Dorico, Dorico has been out for over a year now. But it struck me as a very conscious choice on the part of your team to sell the software for a fixed price, to not go a subscription route, which does seem to be one of the things that a lot of software makers are experimenting with right now. It's a sustainable way to support development and make sure that people eat and that software lives. So I don't know, is there anything you feel like would be interesting to share on that? It's very clearly, it's a decision I appreciate, because there is such a thing as subscription fatigue, I believe.
Yeah. For sure. I think on the one level you sort of look and you say, well, we already pay for our mobile phones or our cell phones monthly, we pay for our TV monthly, we pay for our electricity, our gas, our water, our utilities, we pay for those monthly or at least on a regular basis, we pay our rent monthly, so why shouldn't we pay for our software monthly as well? And maybe in the fullness of time that really is the way everything will go. But Steinberg actually takes a different view on that whole thing, and in fact it's a view that is driven by our customers. So a little while ago, I think probably maybe 3 years ago now, and of course we should probably ask this question again and again, to check that our customers still feel the same way. But we asked our customers, do you want subscription pricing? Do you want it as an option? Do you want it to replace the current pricing model that we have? And the answer was overwhelmingly that they did not want that our customers do not want subscription pricing. And so, that we took that feedback from our customers, and we have continued to do what we have always done, which is to basically, we make a thing, we put the thing on the market, and we say, hey, look, here's the thing, and if you've got an older version of the thing, you can have this version of the thing for this much less money than its real price, and if you would like it, then you can buy it, and if you don't like it, then cool, then we'll make another thing in the future, and you can decide then whether you like the look of that thing any better than this one. And I think that that works for us, and in a way, people also with some of Steinberg's other products that have been going for a lot longer than Dorico has, there is a certain kind of expectation about what the release cadence is going to be. We just released Cubase 9.5 a few weeks ago, just a couple of weeks before Dorico 1.2 came out, and generally speaking, there has been a new version of Cubase, either a 0.0 or a 0.5 release, in November or December of each year for each of the last, quite a few years, certainly as long as I've been at Steinberg, and I'm sure for quite a few years before. And that isn't a subscription because you don't have to buy it, but roughly speaking, what that release cadence is going to be. And so you know that if you don't choose to get on board this year, which means that you would pay a lower price if you were on, say, last year's version, that you're going to pay a slightly higher price for next year's version. But if you're happy with the capabilities you got now and this new version doesn't look especially exciting to you, then there's no real impediment to waiting if you want to see what's coming next year or in next 2 years or whatever the interval might be. So, and I think the other point that I would like to make about it is that, particularly when it comes to secondary education, and I think maybe I can't speak perhaps with great authority about the US schools these days, but certainly my experience of schools in the US when I was traveling over there and talking to a lot of K through 12 teachers, and certainly when I'm here in the UK looking at secondary education, the secondary schools and high schools and so on are not run in the same way that a university is run. Quite a lot, especially in the States, of the funding that comes in for music programs is done through fundraising by, parent-teacher associations or by grant writing or all these sorts of things. And here in the UK, the music teacher might well have a small budget, but it's going to be too small that he's not going to be able, or she's not going to be able, to devote 50% of it to just maintaining software licensing for the coming year, because they've got instruments to repair and sheet musics to buy and headphone cables to replace and peripatetic music teachers to pay and all the rest of it. So we know that a huge sort of chunk of our market, which is that secondary education market, can't afford to buy things on subscription. They don't know if they're going to have that money next year. It might take them 2 or 3 years to save up to upgrade their existing copies of Cubase or Sibelius or Dorico or whatever it is. So if we were to take the view that we have to sell the software that way, that would actually potentially cut off a huge and important part of our market, particularly because, of course, having students using the software in their educational institutions as they're coming up and deciding whether or not it's an industry or a business that they would like to be in, what they've used in college or in school is going to play a big part in which tool they gravitate towards when they actually do take their first steps in the profession. So, and again, that first step in the profession, on the one hand, I might not have $30 a month or whatever to spend on this product, but maybe I can scrape together the money to buy the entry-level version, and then I can trade up later on, but I don't have that guaranteed monthly outlay that otherwise I would have with a subscription. So I think we try to be led by what our customers tell us, and so far what our customers have told us is that they would prefer not to pay by subscription.
And I'm one of those, and I know why software is going that route, but for now, I'm thankful that one type of software that I use, I can still purchase that way. Part of me is, I'm not too young to remember going to the software store with my mom, as a child and buying, picking up a cardboard box off the shelf with a $50 price tag. And that was our software until... Those were the days. Yes, so different. Well, even not that recently, it wasn't that long ago that you could even just walk into like an Apple store and some of the, like FileMaker would be in a box.
Absolutely.
So yeah, it is a very different thing. But yes, a couple of my really prized pieces of productivity software have gone that route, and I've had to ask myself some tough questions this year, and ultimately, some of them got cut and some of them stay, and I guess that's the gamble.
Yep, exactly.
I want to be really conscious of your time. You've given me a lot of it, and I think is it 10?
It is 10:15, yes. Woe betide anybody who decides to listen to all nearly 2 hours of this conversation so far. I'm sorry to all of your listeners for going on so long.
Well, I have to say, I'll say a couple of things, just for you, and I think anyone who listens to this probably is aware. Being a teacher and having a podcast that has no monetary benefit for myself, there's a point of diminishing returns for me, and I think when editing, I tend to, especially if I really enjoy a conversation, I tend to leave a lot of it in, and I actually have been recently, I've been really experimenting with chapters, which I think are great. I don't know that most podcast players support chapters yet, but I think they're really great. Actually, a developer I respect, one of the founders of Tumblr, maker of Instapaper, now is a podcaster. He just released a tool for handling the metadata, chapters included, for podcast publishing. So I'm going to actually use that tool for the first time. Very excited. It's been a little
Forecast, while. Yes, I've been following Marco for a long time. So yeah, I think that's great. And of course, I don't think I actually listened to any of the podcasts I listened to, dozens of them. I don't think any of them use chapters yet. So it will be interesting to see whether Marco making that tool available is going to actually make chapters a thing, because it would be great if it did.
I think they're great, and I continue to think that podcasting is, just fantastic. I obviously don't have any ads, but one of the things I respect so much, especially the podcasts that are so much based in casual conversation, is that I think that the ad reads represent the truest form of native advertising that I've seen on the modern web. Just a really casual read through of, and in some cases, an endorsement if need be. I think a lot of things that I have purchased and accepted into my life that are products have been on tech podcasts where, actually Marco's podcast comes to mind.
Yep.
And I think that's just a really fascinating space to be, and it's easy to be someone like me, a teacher, and just want to. In the case of most of my episodes, actually last year I had a book that came out last fall, and all of last year was sort of taking on different experts on the topics of each of my chapters, and kind of, rather than going through each chapter, trying to have someone else offer a different perspective on each of those topics. And so, sharing that is super fun. I'm super grateful that you are on. I think it's going to be great. So I don't know. Oh yeah, absolutely. I'm sure the only challenge is I, as far as editing goes, I don't know that I want to edit a ton out. I just don't know if I want the discussion about how the software works to maybe grab people up front, but I also like hearing the history of your path with Sibelius and now Dorico has really fascinated me sort of from the outside. So thank you for sharing that stuff in particular.
It's a well-rehearsed story for me by now, but I'm always happy to tell it, because I do know that it's one of those things that I could not possibly have planned, that it has worked out this way in all sorts of ways across the years. But I can't really imagine that I could have planned anything that would have then been better suited to me as a career, in terms of my combining my love of technology and music, and then these really nerdy things to do with typography and engraving, and all. I mean, it's like completely made for me, and I know how lucky I am to have a job that I would quite happily do for free if I could afford to.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I have really quickly a miscellaneous question and I'm going to just throw, as I have probably exposed how much of an edge case user I am when it comes to software. So I'm going to throw at you, this isn't an oddball feature request. I'm sure it's something that's in the process. And then I'm going to invite you to share anything that you didn't already share.
Okay.
So anyway, here I go. Miscellaneous feature request, miscellaneous question. Can I find, I really have some affection for these. Can I find a keyboard covering for the modern MacBook Pro with Dorico keyboard shortcuts on it?
Alas, not yet. No, you can get stickers, but I'm sure you don't want to stick them down on your keyboard. So I actually am thinking about, because I don't know, one of the things I really hate about the MacBook keyboards
don't get me started.
Is they go so shiny after you've used them for a while. So I mean, I have typed on my keyboard many hundreds of thousands of words over the last year, and as a result, the keys have gone all shiny, and it really upsets me. This beautiful thing has got shiny keys now. So yes, perhaps I should have put some kind of keyboard cover on it when I got it a year ago. But there you go. That's just. You have to look at it as it's a well-loved device that I keep with me, literally all hours of the day and night. So, it's my right hand, effectively. I'm left-handed, so it's my left hand, and I wouldn't be without it. So yeah, we did partner with a company to make some stickers, but we haven't yet done any of the sort of rubbery overlay things. But we'll probably look into it. We were sort of worried about doing it too soon, in case we decided that we had to add a whole load of new keyboard shortcuts or maybe change any. But actually, so far we've been pretty good. We haven't had to change any shortcuts really yet. And again, I think because we had the advantage of starting out at the beginning, knowing roughly what features we were going to be adding for the first several years, we kind of almost designed the shortcuts up front as well. So yeah, I think it's now something that we might be able to encourage a third party to do, and hopefully also, as Dorico becomes more established, there becomes more of a critical mass that it's worth these companies manufacturing something. If you're only going to sell to sort of 1% of the population of a user community, then you don't want to be making one copy of something.
Sure.
So yeah, now that we have thousands of users and are growing month to month, then hopefully it becomes an easier thing. So you never know, we might have to find one of these companies and then orchestrate some kind of write-in campaign to get them to add it to their product line.
Right. All right, there was my miscellaneous. All right, now my similarly miscellaneous feature request. Quick preview on the Mac from the Finder.
Oh yes, I agree. That would be so useful. Now that I've got a decent number of Dorico files lurking around in my Dropbox where I keep all my miscellaneous scores, it would be super useful to be able to kind of just quickly see which one is which. So yes, I think there are some interesting challenges with that because of the fact that you've probably noticed that when you open a score in Dorico in the actual application, if it's a big one, it can actually take a reasonable amount of time to open. And some of that is to do with playback stuff, which we wouldn't have to worry about if we were opening it in the Finder. But a lot of it is actually just figuring out how to draw the music. Dorico's architecture is such that it kind of goes off and breaks down the problem into effectively thousands of tasks. We have sort of 150 processes or so for each sort of job to be done, and then those get split up across your multiple CPU cores, and then it eventually comes back and it draws something, and that's optimized for editing. So when you make an edit in the score, then we only reprocess the tiny bit that needs to be done in order to make that edit work. But the downside of that is that when you're opening the score, all of those edits have to be kind of replayed, as it were, and we have tended to take a kind of defensive approach in designing the way that works, so that we can be sure that it will always produce the same result every time. If we cut little corners here and there to make it faster, then we might also risk introducing bugs where, depending on, particularly when you're dealing with these kind of multi-threaded environments, something returns before something else, and either it crashes, which is the worst case scenario, or a later thing gets a different answer than what it was expecting, and so things can become unstable. So that's why when you open a project in Dorico, it takes a lot longer than it does in, say, Sibelius, because it's kind of breaking this whole series of events. It's almost as if you were, it is a very simplistic way of looking at it, but it's almost like typing in the score again at sort of almost infinitely fast speed as it opens it up in order to then produce the result. So if it was having to do that in the Finder in order to then show you a preview, it wouldn't be a very quick look. It would be a pretty jolly slow quick look. So we need to come up with a way of making that faster. And there's lots of ways we could do it. We could start saving when you save the project in Dorico, or at least perhaps when you close it. We could actually then sneakily save some thumbnails in there, and then write a simple quick look plugin that knows where to go looking inside a Dorico file for those thumbnails, and then show them to you, which would then be more or less instant, because if Dorico is the one that's generating the thumbnails before you close the file, then obviously it already knows what the pages look like. It can just save them out as a graphic. So that might be one way to go, but we have to put some time into it to figure out what is the right way to do it. But I think in the medium term, there will definitely be a quick look previewer for Dorico, because it's just too useful not to have it.
I love hearing you say that. That's all. Well, it wouldn't be an ending if I didn't invite you to just share anything that you would think our listeners would want to hear. I do a fair amount of people in music technology and music education make up the audience. So certainly teachers who, and I'm going to guess that, like you said, the nature of teaching, it's sometimes there isn't a lot of money there, and you stick to the tools and you don't have a lot of time in your day to fuss with new things. So I guess with that in mind, I mean, is there anything you would want to share before we close?
Yeah, I mean, I would like to say that although we don't yet have in Dorico some of the more specifically classroom-focused features that maybe our competitors have, whether it's the repertoire that Finale has, or whether it's the worksheet creator that Sibelius has, or maybe even the network licensing stuff that both of them can do to a greater or lesser extent. We have always kept the needs of educators absolutely central to what we've done as we've designed and built Dorico. And I think that even without those classroom features in Dorico in its sort of currently fairly early state, I think that it does have a few superpowers that would make it very interesting to educators. One is the fact that it's super easy to produce really sophisticated learning materials, handouts and things using Dorico's features in engrave mode in terms of the combination of music, text and graphics in a way that is, very unique and very powerful, and you won't need to be sort of dragging music out of your scoring program into, Microsoft Word and then round tripping every time, oh, bum, I forgot to change that thing, or I put a mistake in that music example. So that is I think one thing that Dorico can already make a really positive difference, even if you're not going to use it in the classroom, but in terms of using it for your own preparation or for producing handouts and things for your students or for your teaching. I think that Dorico already has a great deal to offer above and beyond what our competitors can do. And the second thing to say is... Sorry, go ahead, Robbie.
Oh no! I'm losing you for a second. I've seen my colleague, and I'll say I work on a music team before, and between the four of us, there's one other colleague jumped right on board with me on day one, and has been. He's the kind of person who makes me angry because he really learns how to master a piece of software at a ridiculous rate, and he is already in engrave mode, showing me all these beautiful worksheets he's making. So it's all totally. Doable, and like I said before, I mean, I think sure there's always a barrier to entry, but a couple of quick YouTube tutorials really helped me to get my head around how to do some of that stuff.
Yeah, and I think the series that Anthony's done on page layout, which is all finished now and will go up on the YouTube channel just after Christmas, is really going to help to show you in concrete terms exactly how powerful those features in Dorico are and how quick it is to get those kinds of results. So I would definitely encourage people to subscribe to the YouTube channel, which is at youtube.com/Dorico, to see how that develops, because I think there's really some great stuff in there. And the only other thing I wanted to say is, again, just thinking about the use of the software in education and how we've kept that in our sort of minds as we've built it, is that, I think that Dorico has a lot to offer in terms of becoming an introductory tool for helping students to really get their heads around music theory, because it does present an entirely different paradigm for how interactive notation can be in terms of as you type it in, the way that it can change and the way that it can help you to understand how rhythm works, how meter works, and how you can actually develop a musical idea within the software without being hemmed in by the sort of explicitly four-square structure of what Finale and Sibelius can offer. And of course that's also true as an educator yourself. Perhaps you're doing arrangements for your school ensemble. You'll find that Dorico, the flexibility of the input and the editing in Dorico, coupled with the fact the results look great and you never need to basically tweak anything after you've finished it, I think they really do present a bit of a step change in terms of how you can work with this software and get the results that you want, or get the results that your students want, and actually encourage your students to think about music notation and about music theory in a new way. And we will definitely come and add those classroom features and so on as the product matures, wherever it makes sense. I'm not sure we will ever add something like a worksheet creator perhaps to Dorico, because I think, in my experience, teachers, they all have their own specific needs, their own specific ways of approaching topics, and I think it would probably be better for us to spend our time making it as easy as possible for teachers to create the materials that they want, rather than having to adapt the materials that we think they want. But I think that certainly in terms of, things for dealing with, student work submissions and figuring out how to get that back to them with comments and all those other sorts of things, those would definitely be, those workflow things will be things that we will look at in the future. But I think even at this early stage, I think Dorico has a lot to offer the educator, and I really do encourage people to take the time, maybe over a vacation coming up, perhaps if you feel like doing any music prep work while you're on holiday from school. But just maybe take the time to download the trial, and as you suggested, Robbie, make a cup of tea or a pot of coffee, and just spend half an hour watching the write mode videos on YouTube. You'll get a great grounding in what Dorico can do. You'll understand a lot about the concepts behind it, and hopefully you'll find that it could be a really valuable tool to add to your toolbox.
Yeah, I would say it totally has been. So great.
Good.
And again, thank you. Thank
you very much for having me. It's been fun.
I hope you enjoy. I don't know what your experience was like on any of the other three you did, but I mean, the level of technical detail and precision that very clearly goes into the software from your team is very apparent in hearing you kind of nerd out about these details. So.
Yeah, I basically only have one setting, and it's nerd. That's kind of it.
Oh my! Well, maybe in the next version we'll have to do it again, because it's after 10 for you, but I'm sure there are a lot of things that you were a nerd about that are also not Dorico. I mean, I had it on here maybe at some point. I'd love to hear how you're using Audio Hijack outside of recording podcasts.
Yes, we should talk about that. It's a great program, isn't it? It's super, super clever.
Yeah, it's great. It really is. Well, I don't want to hold you any longer, but I do want to say thanks again for staying up so late, and enjoy your holiday. Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you too, and a Happy New Year.
Thanks so much. Great to have you.
Cheers.
Have a good night.
You
Cheers.
too. Bye-bye.